Welcome to this episode of DIY3DTech.com. We're back here at the bench. We're continuing our build episodes for the Zonestar dual extruder printer. So a couple things off camera. I did a couple of the simpler builds and I kind of want to walk you guys through those, give you a little tips and tricks. So again, assembled the motor assembly here as in the instructions. You just some number 3 screws inside here, tighten them down. Notice the positioning of the pulley, important. I don't have this really snug down because it's going to have to be adjusted when I do the belt sequence. The other thing that they point out is loosening the screws on the brass anti-backlash nuts. The idea is when we go to put the lead screws through here that we have a little bit of give on the rods. So that's all set up. And again, this part came pre-assembled. Now, same thing with the other side. I loosened these up so I got a little give on the rod. The other piece are these. These actually go on the underside of here, on the underneath, not on top. I'm just showing you. There seems to be, they got a plastic bushing insert here, and then it's got a stop here. So I'm assuming this goes down. I looked in the instructions, nothing jumped out. It seems to be a little bit ambidextrous as far as design. So I'm going to put it with this side facing down, and it goes in here with a couple self-tapping screws. And so that way this bushing won't work its way out over time. The rod, because the rod pocket here is completely open. The other piece is the Z end stop. So that's where this funny bracket comes into play. The Z stop, it actually goes with the PCB side to the back to the metal piece as you see here, and then it also will mount, and I'll show you when I mount it, goes on in the same type of orientation. So with that being said, I also put the bolts on the heated bed. I'll talk about that more in a bit when we get to that section. So what I want to do in this phase is I want to go ahead and install these uprights and begin the motor assemblies. So this gets a little bit where you need about 3 hands to do it. And actually, it's not that bad. So one of the things we want to do is you'll notice some of these rods don't have threaded ends. So you want to separate those ones that don't have threaded ends because that will be for your X. So this one has a threaded end. And so what we're going to do is we're going to carefully, now when you insert these, and I probably didn't talk about this well enough when I did the bed, you want to be very careful when you do this so you don't push out bearings. Maybe you get a bearing or two that pop out. You know, these are cheaper bearings, so that's okay. You want the threaded piece to go to the top, just like this, and then we want to be able to slip this on just like this. So this assembly will look like this. Now there's a little pocket hole down here for the rod to slip in. And this is where it'll go, and then you just kind of press up on this a little bit, and then this will cover over this hole right about here, because what happened is this will slide up, and then what we'll do is we'll take these self-tapping screws and we'll just put these in here like this, and once we get this lined up, then this just goes in and just like this. And so we'll tighten these. I'm going to tighten these down first and get these assembled. And I'll try doing some overlays just so you can kind of see how this goes on, because I really want to show you guys how this goes together. So if you have any questions, because I think this will be a pretty reasonable intro kit. It probably is actually in a way a little bit easier than the Tarantula to build, which I thought that was pretty straightforward. It's got a few more pieces with the way that the structure is put together versus with the maker rail, but you know, not bad at all. So now the other thing is we're going to pick up, I think, take a screw, put it in the top here, and we got to get the right size screw. Picked the wrong size. Whoops. I took a divider out of the box because my fat fingers couldn't get in there, so now some of the screws have been mixed. So I'm going to take this and now screw this in here, and this side will be done. So we now have the uprights. I'm going to install the other ones before I do the Z-axis rod. So again, On this other side, I'm going to find, see, this one's got, you know, no opening, so I'm going to set that one aside. And so this one does. And so again, very similar. The motor's going to go on the outside of this. When you insert this, you want to make sure you get it very straight through there so you don't knock any of the bearings out. And then what we're going to do is, like with that, the other side, or the left side, or right side, sorry, we're going to put this in there like that. And then what we're going to do is slip this in the pocket. Well, what I'm going to do is maybe move this over a little bit so you can see it better. I'm not sure how my framing is working, but I know if I set it here. So now, with this assembly like this, I'm going to pop this in, just like I did the other one. And that one slid down very easy. Actually, a little bit too easy, but anyways, I'm going to go, this one I'm going to start with putting the screw in first to kind of hold it, because I don't have the downward pressure of the top to hold it in place. So I want to put this screw in first. So we'll tighten this screw in first, and that's good. And then we'll put our self-tappings in. Okay, now with these in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to insert the threaded rods. So I'm going to take the rod, I'm going to slide it down through this bushing, and then I'm going to thread it into the brass nut. And that went in really nice and easy. I'm going to take my Allen driver here and just kind of loosen this up so this drops in. Again, I'm not overly worried about truing all this up right at this second. This needs to be lifted up a little bit. So actually I'm going to lift this up, because what's happening right now is this rod is below this bushing. So we need to raise this up a little bit, and so I'm going to do that actually by raising up on the motor a little bit, and just so we get to the bottom of that, and then I'm going to snug this back down. And again, as I've already mentioned, I'm not going to overly worry about truing this up nor tightening these up just as yet, because one of the things after I get this thing completely built is when I'm going to true it up, because that's just going to make it easier to true up, because once you tighten up or adjust one side, it's going to affect the other side, and so you kind of got to do it all at once, or at least that's what I found success with in the past. And so I'm going to do very similar, slide this rod down, and one of the things I noticed is these are pulling a little bit out of the piece. So the way that this is bent, so I'm going to have to see either about shimming this down a little bit, or maybe putting a little pressure to bend this down. Again, when I go to true this up, we'll see, because one of the things when we put in our X bars in that, it's going to hold this kind of square, so it's not going to be a huge issue, but I do want to adjust this, and I'll also adjust this a little bit with the lead screw here. So now with this one, I'm well into that, but I need to also open this up to let this drop down into our flex coupler. And now that we've dropped this down into our flex coupler, again, we're outside of the bushing, so I want to loosen up the bottom, and I'm going to make up the difference on the bottom. I guess it's 1/2 dozen of the other. I would rather the rod be well situated into the flex coupler, and then adjust up a little bit on the shaft. Now, one of the things, if you watch my other videos, especially running 2 Z screws or 2 Z motors, you want to adjust the bottoms of these. And again, I will do that piece when I go to true this all up. And so one of the things, I want to run this up here so I'm a little bit level. Well, actually, I'm going to try to get fairly close to being level, because the next stage of this is going to be to insert the hot end. So now I've got my hot end assembly here. I'm just going to set it here for a minute. And what I'm going to do is the rods I had set aside before, I am going to go okay, so I did a quick time lapse, so it took a little bit of force and a little bit of cleanup on these, so I had to use a ream to clean out the opening of this a little bit because there was a bit of excess plastic in here. The top bar gave me a little bit of difficulty. I had to use a bit of a ball peen hammer, be very careful, tap on the end, and drove it through, and then the bottom one went in far better. Also, when you do that, don't forget to put your hot end on. I almost forgot that as I got into being real careful about, you know, bracing this and holding everything. I almost forgot to put the hot end on, and that would have been bad. Because this is basically a one-way street. Once this goes on, this is on here. So, you know, getting these back out would be very difficult. You'd probably have to drill a little hole in the end here because there are stops inside this bracket that stops the rod from going all the way through. You'd probably have to drill a little hole and take a punch and kind of tap them backwards, but there's a lot of pressure in between these that are holding this rod in place. So again, pretty much a one-way street going in there. So now that we got this piece done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift it up on end and let that slide back. And then what I'm going to do is install the Z-stop, and I'm going to put the wire behind. Now you notice that there's some adjustments. I'm going to set it to the top adjustment, and just use. And then again, when I go to true this up and center this and get this all working, then I'll adjust it to my needs because I am going to put some PIE on top of this bed. So I probably will have to come down maybe one screw hole. But one of the things and it's a personal preference, I prefer to be a little bit taller on the bed. You know, some might argue that that might introduce some swaying or some other anomalies in movement that you don't want. I haven't had an issue with it, and it gives me more latitude to change surfaces and things like that. So we now have our Z-stop on. So that's pretty much all set up. And then with that, let's take a look. I think as far as mechanical assembly, we're now ready to move on to the belts. Okay, so as we come back, I'm installing the belts on the bed first, and I'm going to give you a couple tips. So I've already looped it back around. So again, the idea is you take the belt, and when you cinch it, you use the zip strip to cinch it so the teeth are pulling against one another like this, if you haven't installed this before. Now, I'm going to show you a couple tricks to installing the belt on this. So first thing is, I've loosened the screws here because there's no tensioner. So one of the things, I've loosened the screws a bit, so I have about 1 millimeter to a play here. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten this as tight as I can get it by hand. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pair of hemostats, and then I'm going to use the hemostats to hold the belt in place to be my third pair of hands in this case. And while this holding that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a zip strip and then put it around here. Now, one of the things you notice, I've held this a little bit back to give myself room to get the zip strip in here. Plus, since this is angled, what this will do is also help me tighten up the zip strip a little bit more as it pulls down and cinches down. Now the second piece is I'm going to take a pair of pliers like this, and while I'm holding my thumb against here, I'm going to use this to pull up on this and actually pop that off so that does the double duty. So that's now cinched tight. Now I'm going to remove my hemostats, and then what I'm going to do is, this is pretty tight, I'm now going to make sure the pulley's straight, and I'm going to tighten this back up. And now I know I've got a good tight fit for my belts here, so I won't have any problems there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to snip off the excess, so I've got nice tight belts. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back around and do a similar setup for the hot end, because we got way it looks, the mounts for the hot end are right here on the side. So I'm going to have to come around to the back side. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do this off camera. It's going to work like this, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. Okay, so we're back. So we've now installed the belt on the x-axis. I'll do some overlays here so you can see how I've done it. Now, typically I like to go with 2 zip strips to hold the belt, and I like to invert the ends, as you can see in the pictures, to kind of give it a little bit more stability and even things out. I didn't do it on the bed down here because one of the situations is how far the bed comes forward. It would pull the extra into the pulley, so that's why I stayed with 1. But there's enough room between the sides here on these things for it to go in and not get caught in the motor or the pulley, so that's why I went with 2. I did the installation pretty much like this, although I couldn't cheat and do the slide. Normally there's adjustments on the motor over here, but there isn't, so it's just pretty much what it is. So you have to kind of stretch it out pretty much by hand. Anyways, this pretty much builds this out. I've also added the heated bed on here, so pretty simple, straightforward. Just put the screws in it, as I mentioned at the onset. Springs, thumb screws, done deal. So pretty much the mechanics of this bad boy are together. So in the next episode, I'm going to do a shorter one, probably a midweek episode, where I build the extruders and install them, because again, I don't want this video to run too long, want to make it digestible. So I'll do that in a separate video, and then the final build video will be putting all the electronics together. I expect that, and that's typically the case, takes the longest. So to get to this far, maybe 2 hours. If you're really good and you've done it before, maybe an hour. So again, it's gone together very well, no issues. All the parts have been here, so I'm pretty excited about that. I'm pretty excited to get this working. So anyways, don't forget the swag shop up in the corner. Hit me up with any questions or comments down below, and tell you what, we'll see you in the next video when we do the extruders. See you then. Cheers.
Please click like below and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date on all of our projects.